passage is quite long. If you want to read it at home, it's the first 41 verses of John chapter 9 that tells the story of the man who was born blind, who Jesus met, and who was then interrogated by his fellow Jews, by the leaders in the community, the Pharisees. His parents were under interrogation, and eventually he met Jesus, who healed him and became his disciple. And 41 verses is quite a lot to read in any sermon, in any service, really. And so I'm going to focus on the first couple of verses, as was just read now, the first 7 verses. And to put this into context, I'll remind you about the Gospel according to John. This Gospel is full of miracles and signs. And he does this, John used these to point us towards Jesus being the Son of God, who he really said he was. And so in chapter 20, verse 31, is an explicit statement of why this gospel was written. And what precedes it is what is known in some circles as the Book of Signs. And the Book of Signs has 7 signs that John uses to teach us about Jesus and who he was and what he came to do. And the first sign is where he turns water into wine. The second one is where he heals the nobleman's son. And then there's the healing at the pool. And then there's the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water. And then in chapter 9 you get what we've just read this morning, the healing of the blind man. And then the ultimate in this book of signs in chapter 11, when Jesus raises Lazarus, his close friend, from the dead. And every one of these signs points towards a deeper revelation of the identity of God. The first sign, for instance, points towards God being generous. That's a party where he was. It wasn't a holy setting. It wasn't a worship service. It wasn't a dedication of leaders or ministers or elders. It was a party, a wedding, and the wine ran out. And so Jesus turned the water into wine so the party could continue. A generous God, not only interested in those holy moments that we dedicate to him, but even interested in the way we celebrate and where we celebrate. Feeding of the 5,000 pointing towards Jesus providing nourishment, not only for their physical bodies, but also for their spiritual, emotional needs, by giving himself, ultimately, on the cross and in the empty tomb. And so here, when Jesus heals this blind man, we should ask, what happened? What is he revealing to us? And what Jesus reveals so ironically is truth. That those who think they can see are blind to the truth, whilst the one who was blind, and by the testimony of those around him, a sinner, is the one who sees Jesus. But our Lent journey is a journey where we ask questions. Where we ask questions about ourselves, about our scripture, about life, because we want to deepen our faith. That's this journey. It's a journey where our faith is encouraged and nourished and grown by asking questions. And as a boy growing up, I often heard there's no such thing as a stupid question. There might be a stupid answer, but questions in themselves are not supposed to be stupid. But here, I mean, maybe I shouldn't have used the word but to start that sentence. So let me rewind. Here we find Jesus' disciples asking not a stupid question, but the wrong question. Revealing their own thinking. Revealing their own truth. That the blindness of this man must be because of the sin of someone. So who was it? Was it himself? which would be pretty harsh, given that the testimony in the Word says he was born blind. Was it his parents? Whose fault is this? And this cause and effect theology, or cause and effect thinking about God, permeates through history a lot of what we have seen and heard about the gospel, about how people talk about Jesus. There's a drought, therefore God must be angry, which in turn means someone did something wrong. The opposite's true as well. There's a flood. God must be angry, someone did something wrong. There's a cause and effect. There's sin, and therefore there is punishment. We find it in this story so much. And the problem with cause and effect theology and thinking in this way about God is that we bypass the people in this story. We take the problem high to a theological level where we want to argue about what was the cause, because God on that theological level is angry and disappointed and therefore punishing. And we forget that in this story there is a man who could never see. If you couldn't see, or you lived with a disability in this world, the ancient world, you were outcast. You were worthless, so to speak. Our society is working hard against that. But often, it's still true. But if you're not fully able, you're kind of just second-rate. Sit there whilst those of us who are able tell the story. While those of us are able share the gospel. Those of us who are able build the church. The story that the question that they should have asked is not whose fault is it, but how can we help? How can we heal? How can we partake in the journey of this man in such a way that God is revealed? And that is what we see in how Jesus interacts with him. There is a miracle that God alone can do. But all the other interactions that Jesus has with this man is something that his disciples, that the Pharisees, that the neighbors and the Jews in the community, all of them could have done exactly that. But what we read in the story is that they didn't. And when he was healed, the question then was, how is this possible? Maybe you lied to us. Still not seeking the revelation of God. Still trying to understand the cause and effect thinking of the first world, the ancient world. But it's in our world as well. And so when we ask questions to deepen our faith, let us seek to ask questions that seek the revelation of God, that seek to understand God and God's input in our lives and in the scenario we find ourselves in. Life isn't easy. And my children this week, we had a conversation about, that's unfair. And I said to them, well, nowhere in the Bible it says life's going to be fair. It's just not fair. And there's a lot of reasons for that and for our experience of it not being fair. But maybe the question shouldn't be, how can we make life fair? For maybe that would be the same kind of question as, whose fault is it that he's blind? In this world that the story is written in, illness is often a metaphor regarding that person or that group or that community as less than. And it creates this problem that has to be addressed. That's what we read when we read there was a group of lepers living on the outside of town. It uses that community as a metaphor for something needs to happen there. And often we then read how Jesus reveals God's identity in that, whilst the community asks cause and effect kind of questions. I read one commentator asking even if this was a problem. For often we create this problem that needs to be solved without even understanding if it is a problem at all. I think all of us wants to see. But let me tell you a story of what happened in Lesotho, which is a mountain kingdom, completely surrounded by South Africa. But it's a country on its own legs. You need a passport to go in and to come out. The people in Lesotho live very basic lives. They are herdsmen. They care for cattle. It's a mountain kingdom so high up that there are no trees. It's just too high. So everything they need for fire to survive in that sense needs to be brought up by donkey. And they live in these communities, these huts, so to speak, where they have all the tribal leader structures that you would expect to be there. And so one day, a missionary, an American missionary, arrived on the scene and saw that these villages don't have sanitary ablution facilities. There are no toilets. And thought, that's an easy problem to fix. Let's build a septic tank and put a toilet in for them. And they did that. Phoned back home, someone transferred the money, and they built this system. As a result thereof, the tribes became very, very ill. Very ill. For never in their history had there been pools of human waste brewing bacteria in the volumes that they now had to have. What was a problem from the American point of view was not a problem for the cities. They were fine. They had other challenges. And so I often think of this story and ask myself, what am I seeing as a problem that isn't necessarily a problem? And it's a deep theological question when we look at building the church, when we look at sharing the gospel, when we look at changing and embracing society. What is it that God is actually calling us to do? In our story this morning, and I'm going to wrap up, it's the wrong questions they ask. All of them. The disciples, the Jews, the Pharisees, perhaps even his parents, they all asked the wrong questions, seeking cause and effect rather than God's revelation. And so may we, in our Lenton journey, use this question, this very bold question of who sinned, to remind us to inspect and seek the questions we ask, to test them, to discern with God, what is it that we're asking? And may we seek the revelation of God in our world.